Making objects look like they belong in an environment will oftentimes be a must on visualization projects, and one of the tools that we can use to help accomplish this in Unreal is the ambient occlusion feature, with AO basically being a form of indirect shadowing. An overcast day, as an example, would be a typical scene in which we would expect to see lots of indirect shadowing. Helpfully, the light mass renderer in Unreal does calculate detailed indirect shadows by default, and so we have actually been getting and seeing ambient occlusion in the course with each light build up to this point. It is always good to know how to both turn such effects on and off though, should we ever want or need to, and also know how to adjust the settings associated with ambient occlusion in order to give creative control over the indirect shadows in the scene. Given that we have, as already noted, been using a post-processing volume in the scene as well, we have also been seeing screen space ambient occlusion applied as a post-process effect in each light build that we have made. The upsides to using SSAO, as it is oftentimes called, are that it is quick to calculate, memory efficient, and we get fairly decent results from it. The downside, however, is that it is calculated using just screen space, and so as objects roll out of camera view, they stop generating ambient occlusion, which can cause some very distracting pops and jumps as ambient occlusion on an object disappears from view. Ambient occlusion created by light mass GI, on the other hand, is baked into the light maps, and so will not only always cause objects in the scene to add AO, but will also appear to never pop, flicker, or disappear as the user navigates through the level. Although, admittedly, the ambient occlusion is not always as clean as we may perhaps like, and in some cases, such as with our scene here, may not work too well with thin wall geometry. Although, in my humble opinion, and for a whole bunch of reasons really, we really shouldn't be using thin wall geometry for our production visualization pieces anyway. Our O2_03 level is, at this moment in time, being lit with both a directional light and a HDRI, and has essentially had the screen space ambient occlusion option turned off by virtue of setting its intensity value to 0 in the post-processing volume. Indeed, in the first bake of the lighting that we are looking at now, if we press the 2 key to make sure that we are viewing one of the corners of the room, and then come to the World Settings tab and Light Mass Options, we can see that our GI ambient occlusion option has also been turned off as well. Now the first option here, Use AO, will obviously enough enable all of the options that we see here, and so let's put a check in that and discuss the rest of the parameters that we have. If we rebake our lighting now, and then compare to our previous setup, we can see that we are clearly adding occlusion shadows to the scene. The next checkbox, entitled Generate Ambient Occlusion Material Mask, does exactly what it says, and creates an alpha representation of the AO for us, one that will need to be used with the pre-computed AO mask material node should we want to access and make use of it. Now we're going to look at some of the controls here, a little out of running order now, simply because, as we look down the list, we have a max occlusion distance parameter, which by default is set at a value of 60. This, in my honest opinion, is way too high for visualization pieces in general, and so is actually wasting some of our bake time, 60 Unreal units equating to 60 centimeters of course. Let's set this to a value of 8 then, which is still pretty high, and rebake our lighting. When we compare the two bakes now, we can clearly see the difference, as we now get a nice occlusion effect at what I would call an average or normal object distance. Now, the first option here that actually lets us control the amount of occlusion that we get would be the direct and indirect occlusion fraction options, that set just how much occlusion gets applied to objects that are being hit by both direct and indirect lighting. These act as a 0 to 1 percentage of the other controls that we will look at in a moment, with 0 applying no ambient occlusion and 1 adding the full amount. Let's set both direct and indirect values to 1 then, after which we can rebake our lighting. And now we can take note of how the occlusion is looking. Notice that these changes have really darkened up the AO effect as a whole. Of course, if we were to set both values at 0 and rebake again, we would effectively kill off the ambient occlusion effect. Now, we do need to keep in mind that because we have been increasing global illumination quality as we have moved through the course, our direct and indirect bounces are themselves doing a pretty good job of creating ambient occlusion, which is why we have had to make such a drastic comparison here. Let's set these to more realistic values of 0.3 and 0.6 then, and again rebake our solution. Next, we have the exponent control, which sets the contrast or transition phase of the occlusion effect. Now, this could be thought of as applying a levels control to the occlusion gradient. As we increase the exponent, the transition from light to dark becomes tighter, helping push our occlusion into the corner areas. Our current bake is using the project default value of 0.65, and so let's set this to a high value of 2 and rebake our lighting again. What we see as we compare now is that the occlusion has definitely shifted, which may be useful if we feel that things are spreading out a little too much. Now, we're going to leave this set at a value of 1.15 for the remainder of the course. As we do also have ambient occlusion override controls on post-processing volumes, you will need to make sure that you are keeping track of exactly what is affecting what in the visualization in order to get the best out of it.